Hey there, welcome to possibly the last part of this small series I made by accident, or better yet the last major part before more addendums are made or small episodes. Hopefully it was a fun ride for you, because for me it was fun and while exhaustive, I did find quite enjoyable, even if my upload schedule is a little bit, quirky. Pro tip, don't change your editing software while you're still learning the old one. Anyways, welcome. In this episode now, we get into Fall of Empires. Civilizations and nations also apply. When empires collapse or kingdoms, it generally goes a few ways. In terms of involving world building, well, the most obvious one is that it's a terrible time to be alive. In the first episode, that do not deal with definitions, I said that few think of what to do when empires begin to rise, as you would be on the shopping block list. Well, in this episode, where most people ask how they would survive a collapsing empire, because, well, you can very much see examples of countries that imploded IRL to know how bad things can go. This is the closest to our time frame we can get to the accuracy of how things can go south. Well, partially, there are people who still judge things as they have always been like this, instead of adapting a more complex worldview. Forgive me for bringing some stuff I shouldn't, because... Anyways, let us talk of how empires begin to fall apart. Generally, when nations begin to collapse, they can go via many ways. The usual one used for that in some stories is generally the final fight between our heroes against the tyrannical empire. If it's a revolution, just imagine a transition to democracy. Even if, historically speaking, it's not always a smooth transition, well, it can be a statue rotation at times. But when empires collapse, a time of change is generally the main trope that is adopted. Well, that in case of the story is not a doomer mode, generally by folks who haven't moved past the little dark age memes. Transformation and change always come after decay and destruction, resulting in an age of rebirth after a long period of conflict. Albeit those are more post-crisis events, of course. Now into the fun part, how those empires begin to collapse. Well, it gets complicated fast, especially as this topic is abused by bad actors with cheap slogans and, before anything, I don't have a history degree, mostly a hobby I like. I have expertise in politics, but that doesn't make me immediately right on everything. Do your own research always, and as the first rule of the internet dictates, don't trust everything you see. Retard. So what do we know when empires fall? Well, obviously a loss in states and societies collapsing is always a fascinating topic, because, well, you would not want to be in the blast area when that happens. Plus also, fuck's sakes. Yeah, it's a very academic hard thing to research, that and also several crisis actors shouting of the next disaster as well. This is a topic that writers that want to dive academically can find a lot of sources and many historical events to help, albeit many writers also prefer the easy path called the Alexander the Great path. A lot of them take this path. But one rule that everyone kind of forgets is this is not normal. It's not a normal way for an empire to fall, this is rather a hair, and it's because Alexander never had time to consolidate his new empire. Albeit he did state he would try to conquer Carthage in some letters, but that is another story. Most of the time when following this path, taking down the leader, it would just cause someone else to appear, and depending on how bad the first guy fall, you can end up with someone that is even worse. Which can be a very interesting story as well, be it the group of heroes take down the BBG, only for that to cause a worse person to take its place and cause things to escalate. Albeit it's hard to justify this in a story since you technically took down your thematic villain, hence why it's not used a lot. Unless you want a bigger threat to become a newer threat, but that also is allowed, of course. This might turn confusing readership in some people's eyes, so if you're not careful, good luck. Alternatively, and mostly used in more kingdom stories, but can also work in an empire setting, if one of the cast of colorful characters is the long-lost heir of the kingdom, or the legitimate heir of the nation as a whole, this is generally a way to patch it as the rightful prince is put in charge of a nation. You may reply, this is not an empire collapsing, I hear you, to which I reply, ask the Chinese dynasties. But as you know me, things are more complex than they look, especially if you pay attention to my college speech that occasionally pops up about how state government entities are not centralized around a single person, but other bureaucratic entities of institutions that are bigger than they look, and we are now back at the side of my brain, so to explain what I mean, the ruler has changed, but the gears that resulted in the previous tyrant has not, and with the tendency of those being medieval settings, when this happens, things going to the better are more playing with dice rather than anything good. Let's just say it's a bit depressing when you look at things this way. This is very much by design. A story often ends before these questions begin to surface, and also because not many people know how complex the game is. And most of the time it's easy to flash the explosions and ignore the world is in black and white at times. Which brings it back to the good old trope of blowing it up and hoping it works. This is also fine. In today's days of complex morality, we don't need to dig too deep, especially because it can very easily fly off what a writer is trying to tell. What I just said is mostly optional for a writer to tell a story. Most of the time a story revolves more about hope, friendship and such, and well, having the nerd state that it isn't that easy and is actually very likely the happy ending will be blown up in time is not a good sell for realism settings. But not always. Sometimes in revolution-centric stories that touch on, well, revolutionary ideas, they actively tear the entire structure down, allowing for a debate over the perpetuity of institutionalism. After all, the idea of revolution being hijacked by the same forces that oppressed them can also be very useful for tragedies. Now, changing topics back, let us talk of ways an empire may collapse. The first and most used one is when one of the characters of the story is a prince replacing the current regime. This is fall of empire is generally what I call a category 1, a collapsing of the ruling regime or a dynasty change. This is quite common in insert Category 1, or simply how I call Reformation, you can probably invent a name, is less destructive, well, not really, but still is if you think about it a bit, and realize that a war replacing a dynasty can cause a whole load of problems. First is if your character is a member of the same family that was in charge, it can be well stabilizing, but it may also cause issues pertaining to how the nobles may accept someone jumping the family tree. Well, now dealing with the consequences of a person with little connections or just from a new family taken over are well bigger and more explosive, as an entire nation is gonna have a massive amount of upheaval. Kingdoms generally gain stability from a single family maintaining order, except in elective monarchies, but even then the Holy Germanic Empire, with its electoral system, was consolidated to a single family for 300 years. Without counting other families that manage small consolidations compared to the Habsburgs, but that is another story. This is generally less of how an empire falls and more something I had to add, because it technically can count, but most of the time it just aligns with the return of the prophesized hero. Unfortunately, it also is marked as a fall of age, so it needs to be added here. So let's move on to the Hell Pit, where civilizations wish they were so fucking lucky. The second way an empire collapses, and we get into the harder to write, but not really, because declaring independence is quite common in some stories. Yeah, the second way the empire collapses is the way Britain went. Basically, its colonies breaking away from its core regions. Independence from an empire is not uncommon, as has happened many times, with the USA being an example. But while the USA is an example of just a single region breaking apart, an entire empire reaching this level of breaking apart is difficult. The British Empire had multiple economic crashes, 2 world wars, and even after that, only its hardest to hold regions managed to leave, aka India, and still managed to hold out for a long while, even if it was effectively burning it. But story-wise, it can be a very good way to end the empire. Its colonial regions that were already prone towards separatism begin to gain independence, as the might of the empire buoyed up through the story falls apart. Now the question raised is, what is the con? Well, besides a force of stability breaking off causing anarchy and war, unless you have an international body whose entire job is to make sure that all free nations can discuss matters of interest equally and has many sub-institutions whose whole job is maintaining worldwide stability, And then it gets shit talked by rich people from the first world for being ineffective even though it works incredibly well.
Are you serious right now, bro?
Anyways, another consequence is just the homeland of the empire becoming very poor and most likely collapsing into reactionism or just remaining poor due to being unable to adapt into a time after its glory days. Also, this is the same way stuff like Alexander the Great story where you destroy the evil guy and cause stuff to explode and move on, but kind of more complicated. Basically ignore the chaos I speak about again, but wars. If you couldn't figure out what I stated, if a road has an industrialized version of fantasy British Empire, imagine it going down kicking and screaming. If you know what I said, you have no fucking idea. Basically, the world after it would be pandemonium, unless you have a way to stabilize it, but hey, that's how things generally go. Anyway, this is the main I once generally adopted in stories, but I missed something. I touched the Alexander way, I touched the American way, the breakup way, but there's one version that can be bad. After all, there are no more Latins or Romans, so to speak, to found around anymore. The next way an empire collapses is the way Rome went, a collapse of an empire and civilization so deep and devastating that not only destroyed its own political entity but also took down its culture in the process. This is not common as well. There are no more Romans, and while Italians like to claim descendancy of Rome, linguistically speaking, Romania is closer to Latin, and if you read a history book, a lot of European civilizations also claim true descendancy of the big R. This is because the motherland and fatherland of European culture has in some ways been impacted by this empire. A dead empire, with a dead culture. This is the least used form when an empire collapses except in nuclear cautionary stories. A civilization collapsing so heavily that its own culture is killed, leaving only descendants in its wake. This is actually hard to write. We're talking of something that does not happen immediately but happens gradually over time, and it's, well, sad. It's very hard to make the argument that a culture disappearing is something good. Unless you're blowing up mortar, then that is fine. This got a bit serious at the end, but that's kind of like the problem with the last type. It's the saddest version of how an empire collapses, just one that destroys a people's entire culture, alongside said empire. Well, unless you're a master comedian and can make very good dark jokes, because I am very bad at telling stuff from the fucking stage I am sitting in while having 5 people watching me at best. Anyways, this is still a rather complex topic, yet always fascinating. Civilizations collapsing is not something easy to detail or describe, especially in a story, but as a setting it can be equally interesting being in the latter years of the collapse. Sometimes an empire collapsing can take decades. Most of the time a story will be set in at the very end. This is very much because an empire falling apart is not something that happens overnight. But as my final tip before I send off, just copy Alexander the Great. Everybody copies Alexander the Great, I won't judge. Anyways guys, thanks for watching part 4 of How to Make an Empire series. I think I need to change the name of this playlist when I make it, because it's gonna be long. Anyways, it was fun making this. Next video will probably be a Star Wars one. I am sort of wanna fucking diversify. See you guys around. Hey, it's me. So, if you wonder why I'm late for delivering this, it's because work took a lot of attention, and also because the person that I used to have like a mic recording system, I think that's the word, kind of stopped having it, so I'm basically without a microphone system that is in my laptop, and you probably can tell by the audio. So if you wonder where we'll go from this, it's basically a coin toss. I still will try to do it, but it's basically more complicated. Anyway, see you guys around.